You are at JavaScript is coming to eat you. My name is Tim Broker, otherwise known as Citizen Tim. I am a co-founder and technical director at a great Minneapolis agency that focuses primarily on Drupal and the civic sector. I personally started working on the web as my primary source of income in 1994, a long time ago. In that time, I have built large enterprise-scale websites on 16 different content management platforms over those 25 or some years. And as a result of that, I've sort of been through a lot of changes and trends that have happened in how we, as web developers or clients who are building websites, actually approach building the web. And so this session is sort of an exploration of this new thing that's happening in the sort of sense that JavaScript is kind of taking over the world and how that is affecting people like me and like you and our clients. So I'm just going to jump right in and ask, we're in Iowa, who here remembers the Dean Scream from 2004? Okay, that's a few. Very few people seem to remember this, but in 2004, Howard Dean was a front-runner presidential candidate. I think at the time he was leading in all the polls, and the Iowa caucuses happened in January of 2004. He came in third place, a very shocking, disappointing finish. And I don't know if I have audio here, but I'm going to play this 1 second clip of the. No, it's not going to work because I don't think I'm hooked up to HDMI audio. But this 1 second scream, literally, for those who don't remember, tanked his presidential campaign. He was on repeat on CNN with that scream over and over and over again for the next 3 days, and literally within a matter of days, his presidential campaign was over, okay? But the reason I bring up Howard Dean and the Dean Scream is that the reason he was a frontrunner at that point was he was the first presidential candidate to ever really embrace the internet. It was called the first internet campaign, and he was using a product called Dean Spaces. Anyone heard of Dean Spaces? A couple of you, Tim. Dean Spaces was running on Drupal, and it was built by the guys who went on to found Pantheon and Civic Space, which became the first widely recognized Drupal agency to make money building a Drupal site. And so that year and that platform, to me, sort of kicked off this 10-year period of how we build the web that I like to equate to the Industrial Revolution. And by that, I sort of mean it was the rise and domination of the content management system. In that previous 10-year period, a lot of things had been handcrafted and hand-built in HTML and handwritten database calls. But starting in about 2004, we really went into this age of the CMS and onto software as a service and commercial CMSs, lots of it built on the LAMP stack. And then eventually we got this idea of the cloud and some technologies like Ajax and jQuery and Gmail. And really, for about 10 years, that is how we built the web. But I would argue that right around 2014, I think it's a great jumping off point, as we'll see, some interesting things started to happen in our world, starting with this introduction of these three front-end JavaScript libraries or frameworks. React by Facebook, Angular by Google, and Vue by an independent developer. And now, of course, there are more of these, such as Svelte and several others. And if you attended Drupal camps or cons like this, anytime starting in about 2014, you started seeing session after session about decoupled this, decoupled that, headless this, headless that, and that trend continued and continues today at many, many Drupal events. We saw the rise of Node and other JavaScript libraries, and more recently we've started hearing about the JAMstack and this idea of working with APIs, managed servers, and serverless. So despite that fact, I think how many people in this room have built a decoupled site using Drupal or not? So there's three of us here, okay?
My company has, I did.
Okay, so nonetheless, our company also is we're just about to launch our first truly decoupled website. So I count myself in this group as well that have sort of been maybe a little bit late on this thing that really started happening over 5 years ago now. And to be honest, it's a pretty great place to be. And I'm not just talking about Drupal here, I'm talking about this whole ecosystem of Drupal and WordPress and Adobe Experience Manager and Sitecore and all this model of how we build things. We truly enjoy a multi-billion-dollar global marketplace. I tried to look up some actual numbers, and it's everywhere from hey, by 2022 it's going to be a $59 billion marketplace or 70 billion, so I didn't even bother to include a number, but innovation continues at great speed. We just saw Drupal 8 come out with a slew of new features, and every 6 months we're getting more and more features. It's not like Drupal has slowed down. WordPress continues to innovate with Gutenberg and continues to grow their percentage of how much of the web that they drive. And frankly, for us, our company, and for a lot of you and a lot of our clients, Drupal and WordPress are still obvious choices. And these are just some of the brands that both of these platforms currently run today. And it's just this sort of proven, rock-solid platform that we've all, over this 10-year period, come to rely on as to, hey, here's how we build these complex, ambitious websites. But despite that, I think anyone who's sort of paying attention to our industry and looking around them a little bit, it's pretty clear that despite all that great success, things are changing and quickly. And so these next few slides are just some numbers to demonstrate this. These are all using Google Trends, which is a way to just sort of see how searches are trending over time for various keywords. This one is React and Angular, and you can see similar to my 2014 cutoff date, right around 2014, you see this hockey-like stick growth for both of those platforms. Right around the same period, you see a hockey stick-like growth for headless CMSs, progressive web apps, full-stack developer. These graphs look almost identical to each other, and they all start right around that time period when React and Angular and Vue were first either released and or open sourced. And this one might be the most telling of all. This is a website called Module Counts that tracks, I believe, downloads off of the repositories for the most popular languages, such as Packagist for PHP and Pair. And then, of course, NPM, which is the green line, is Node.js, which drives a lot of this JavaScript ecosystem that I'm talking about. And you look at that number, it's quite overwhelming. And again, there's that date, 2014. So we're 5 years into this period where we've seen this sort of rapid and phenomenal growth of some of these technologies. Now we're going to look at Drupal and WordPress over that same time period, starting in 2004. WordPress in red, Drupal in blue, of course, and you can see that both of those peaked even a little bit before that, and have been on this sort of steady downward trend since that time, kind of the opposite of all those hockey sticks that I showed just a minute ago. Same thing with just this idea of content management systems. Like that was even earlier, where it really, starting about 2004, where I marked that period of the Industrial Revolution, that's kind of when it peaked in terms of its just overall interest. This is more anecdotal, but this is a quote that we got from a recent, we had responded to an RFP, and in that process you often ask questions of the client, and we said, hey, are you guys open to Drupal? And this is the response we got back. We would prefer Ruby and or JavaScript. We would steer clear of Drupal. If any of you have been in the Drupal world for a long time, this is the polar opposite of what it was like in about 2010, 11, 12, where we didn't have to do things like sales. We just had people like, hey, we want to build a Drupal site, and you guys build Drupal sites, and that sort of drove a lot of our businesses. People just wanted Drupal, and I believe that we're now starting to see that change a little bit, and that for a lot of people, WordPress and Drupal are not necessarily the obvious choice. So this is a tweet from Nader Dabit, who is a fairly prominent developer in the React community, and I put it up here because I think it sort of encapsulates a lot of what I just tried to show through some numbers. And that's that there is this massive paradigm shift happening right now, and I believe that, as he does, that those who acknowledge and take advantage of this are going to be the biggest winners in the coming years. And so the rest of the session, we are going to sort of talk about this whole phenomena, some of its implications, and some things that you can hopefully take away to perhaps get yourself out of 2014 and into this modern world. So that's important. Realization number one is that over the past 5 years, we really are sort of rapidly changing how and what we build. So in the face of that, as Drupal developers or WordPress developers or clients or bosses, I believe you have a couple options, right? You can sort of ignore all the stuff that I just showed you and what's been happening over the 5 years and stay the course. That's a very valid option. This is an old famous quote that nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. And the thought behind that quote is like, look, this is a safe, proven path that currently is powering some of the largest brands and websites in the world. How can we go wrong? It's a viable option to just sort of ignore this and keep doing what we do. And I like this slide because this is a recent usage statistics showing that combined Adobe Dreamweaver and FrontPage, which by the way hasn't even been a product since 2007, are still powering 1.2% of the web. So if you never say the word JavaScript again and put your head down and develop Drupal sites, probably in 10 years you'll still have a job and things will be fine. But that said, we're here today to talk more about learning about what's going on and potentially adapting to it, which is what we at Electric Citizen have started doing, and myself. Personally, I have spent over the past year just fully immersed in this world, and I've been learning React and some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about. And I believe, hopefully, sort of recognizing this need that things aren't always going to be the same, and that if we don't learn and adapt, we may have some trouble down the road. So, to sort of understand this, I'm just going to go through a few slides sort of talking about the differences of what we're actually talking about. Like, why is this way we've been doing it so different than the way people are starting to do it today? So I'll have a slide on this later, but I'm calling Drupal, WordPress, Squarespace, Wix, Sitecore, Expression Engine are all monolithic CMSs that all do the same thing and work in largely the same way. And I'll have a slide explaining that. Versus this new paradigm where we have things like decoupled front ends, where your data can live sort of anywhere, and it might show up on your Apple Watch, and it might show up on this little screen here in front of me, or it might show up on the display board outside, or a website, or an app. Often integrated with APIs to pull in data to drive those tools. Managed services, a lot of things have moved to this model of either paying for a service or having a service that you've written to sort of do something behind the scenes to help all this work, and then microservice and serverless, which I won't go into definitions, but they're all sort of these trends and buzzwords that are driving a lot of what's going on today in the world. And of course, the reason this session is called JavaScript is coming to EU is because all of these things are being driven by JavaScript. It's not Ruby, it's not Python, it's not Go, all those are great languages, but this sort of trend in the web and web application world is all largely driven by JavaScript. So this is what we've been doing since 2004, right? We've been building these monolithic CMSs, and again, it doesn't matter which one it is, they're all the same, WordPress, Drupal, Sitecore. The idea is that you've got a web server and a database, and then you have all these things that you want to do for what Dries Bychart, the Drupal founder, calls ambitious websites, right? First of all, you need your content management and your custom applications and maybe database searches, and you probably need to integrate with some things and maybe import some data. You might be running a membership system. You'll probably want to customize lots of things and maybe sell some things, and of course you want people to search and galleries and whatever it might be. Every single bit of that runs through Drupal or your monolithic CMS. And it gets put out on your front end, and it's usually a website. And in the case of Drupal, it's a twig file. All of these things sort of working together through this one central system that all relies on that infrastructure to sort of put out that front end. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard this quote, the golden hammer. I suppose it is tempting if the only tool you have is a hammer to treat everything as if it were a nail. Now, I don't know about you, but I've been developing Drupal since Drupal 5, and I have been guilty of this very thing dozens of times in my career because, frankly, Drupal is pretty great, right? Like, you can do all of these things. It is incredibly flexible, and you can, that long list of things I just did, Drupal just works. But, well, I guess that's the point of this slide, is that, there's a reason that starting in 2014, this was Drupal's growth rate, right? Like, there's a reason we had the same hockey stick growth that all of these other frameworks are having now was happening to us in 2014, and that's because it was really, really great and flexible and allowed us to do all of these really cool things. So by contrast, this is more what I'm calling the modern web looks like. Instead of a web server and a database in the middle, we have something like a node server, or increasingly more not even a node server, a CDN or a static host, and you're just going to push your static files up there and serve it. Excuse me, you've got things like serverless, which is the way I try to describe serverless. It's like these tiny little functions that you can write that do things that Drupal would normally do. So one example I use is, let's say you have a blog and you're reviewing beer. And then you say, boy, it would be great if my readers could rate this beer. Okay, in Drupal, you would install the rating module and you would set it up on your content type, and all that data would go back into Drupal and you'd be done. Serverless, you could just write this one little function and put it on Amazon, and its only job in the world is to click that vote and put it into a data store somewhere so you can use it later. And there's no there is a server, but there's not a server that's spun up. It's spun up at request time, meaning for every vote you get, you might get charged like 0.0001 cents for that microsecond that service ran. but it's a very flexible way to bring things like that in without a monolithic CMS. But then in this world, instead of having a content management system driving your entire application, your content management system becomes a piece of that application. You probably will still need a content management system, but you also might be pulling in data from Google Sheets or Airtable or other APIs. You might run your commerce through Shopify or your authentication through a service like Auth0. You might be pushing up static markdown files or using a third-party search service and building custom databases, all sort of getting pushed in independently of each other, not all through a single system. These can all be different companies, different products, custom things into your cloud, and then it's put out into your front end. And unlike Drupal or WordPress, where you get hey, this is your front end, it's Twig, this is front end agnostic. You can do your front end however you want. And so that sort of leads me to this idea that we're not building websites as we have traditionally built them. Our jobs in the past have been to take these monolithic CMSs and plug together all these things and build a website. I believe that today, that's not what we're doing anymore, because largely all of these other things, whether it's content management or commerce or database storage or search APIs, all of these things have been solved over this 10-year period that we've all been doing it for, right? And commoditized. You can just go sort of buy all these things off the shelf right now. And so if we're not building websites, and if all of these things have kind of been solved, like what are we even doing here, and what is our actual job? And so I would argue that today, the job of the modern web developer isn't gluing together Drupal and being proud that, okay, we built this very complex system. What we really should be focusing on is the front end, right? Users aren't buying a Drupal site or a WordPress site or a content management system or a way to reference content. Our clients and people who are building websites, I hope, are building websites that are effective and fast and easy to use and maybe even pleasurable to use for their users. And so if we agree that our focus should be, how do we take all of this data and present our users something useful, that's actually what I think our job is these days. So that said, I share this myself, and in fact, sometimes I lay awake at night, like, what are we even doing here? This is so hard and brain-numbing sometimes to take this leap from what we have been doing with so much success over the past decade or more, and sort of like trying to is this really sort of the way forward? And I start to ask questions like, well, can't Drupal also provide that good user experience on the front end? And the answer is, of course. We saw the slide earlier with all those logos and brands, and arguably those are great sites that work good and largely have good user experience. Why would I give up all of these features that Drupal has spent decades building, right? We've collectively put so much work into building all these things that, as I'll explain in a few slides later, are largely either gone or very difficult to do in this new environment. And then finally, why, especially historically, in a monolithic CMS, you have this one thing to manage, and that's what you're in charge of, and that's it. In this new model, you've got multiple potential layers of complexity and expense with all these services somehow trying to work together. And historically, that's always been a very expensive proposition. And I always used to, 5 years ago, even when we would get approached with decoupled projects, it would be like, great. Are you prepared to double your budget, double your staffing, and double your support budget? Because you've now got two giant infrastructures to support with lots of moving pieces. And so these are all very hard, difficult problems and reasons to be potentially skeptical of this whole new world. But that said, this is a quote that I just put down. From the dawn of time, web developers have sought to build better websites and to build them faster. That's sort of, I think I don't think anyone is here to build a bad website, right? I don't think that's why anyone gets into the tech career, and I don't think clients are ever like, hey, can you build me kind of a crappy website? No, it's like our job literally is to figure all this stuff out and build good experiences for our clients and for our users. And so despite that skepticism, I think it's important to ask, what if, this has all been great for us, right? I've built my career largely on Drupal, but what if there is a better way to build the web? And so I took these five sort of what I consider 5 key metrics of what we do and why we do it, and sort of sat down and started to compare that traditional monolithic CMS model to this new modern web. And I think that you can objectively argue for all 5 of these that the modern web might just be a better way to do this. Speed and performance, just out of the box, you get things like critical rendering and code splitting. and things like preloading, so that as a user scrolling down a page, it's silently loading the next page behind the scenes for them. You've got this very fast Node engine, which was built on the Chrome V8 JavaScript engine that is extremely fast. Things like static and/or server-side rendering. And don't get me wrong, you can very easily build a very bad, slow website in this world, like really easily. But if you do it right, in fact, I just was working on a spreadsheet comparing Google Lighthouse performance scores for the top 50 sites in the Drupal showcase to some other projects. And the fact is, even on these big popular Drupal websites, very rarely do these sites get above a 60 or a 70, maybe an 80 on that performance score. I then did the same thing for a bunch of JavaScript sites, and again, there are outliers that are bad ones, but very frequently you're seeing performance scores up in the 80s, 90s, and even 100. So I think you can objectively say that done right, this modern web can often deliver better speed and performance. Flexibility. So of course, I showed how flexible Drupal was, but the fact is, in this modern world, I believe it's almost an order of magnitude more flexible in that you can bring your data from anywhere, right? If you have a blogging team who wants a super nice, clean interface just for writing, they might use Ghost CMS to do their writing. You might have a documentation team in your developer department who's pushing up Markdown files instead and committing them right to GitHub. And then you might have a product team who's wanting to track data and links and maybe comments on a bunch of resources. They might have an Airtable, and it goes on and on. Your commerce, your search. All those pieces could be put into the front end in a sort of really agnostic way that does lead to this idea of using the right tool for the right job in a way that Drupal often does not, because often Drupal is not the right tool for the job. This one gets a little more subjective, but I think anyone who's used either a web app or even a native app on their phones or tablets or even on the desktop, that often these just feel faster and more effective and perhaps more delightful. You don't have things like page reloads and jumps. It's just, I think, often a better user experience in those front ends. And then developer experience. This one is one that I have a lot of experience with because, like I said, the last year of my life, I've really been in this world and pushing our development team into this world. And the fact is, it's just fun sometimes to build these sites. It's brought us back to this day of sort of handcrafting things that has been lost, I think, in this world of Drupal, where you're often clicking a bunch of buttons and hoping it comes out all right, and then having a themer pound away at it till it looks pretty good and okay. And so just from a developer experience, in many ways, I believe this new modern world is also better. And this one is perhaps the most subjective of all, and the one that historically has been absolutely not true. Historically, it's always been much more expensive to take this route. But just in the past 2 to 3 years, I think that's really changed, and I'll go into that. I have a whole section of this presentation about some of the things that I've learned and that you can learn that sort of, I think, proves this point, that the overall cost of taking this route in both development, support and maintenance, and hosting and infrastructure can be actually lower than it might be for building a monolithic Drupal site. Again, maybe not always, but certainly it's now possible, and even 5 years ago it was not possible to have that same level of cost balance. So, looking at that, you might say, like, okay, great, I'm no longer skeptical, very clearly, like, this is faster, it's more flexible, we can do more things, it's a better developer experience, and it might even be cheaper than the way that we've been doing it. So, but that said, so let's say you want to go into this world, you absolutely are probably still going to need a CMS of some sort, because you're not going to have everyone entering content into GitHub or Airtables, right? You still will need things like workflow and permissions and content scheduling, and you're probably going to want to take content and relate it to each other and have authors and articles or albums and artists and those types of things. So thankfully in this world, this is an article from CMSWire.com, which has been around for decades now, tracking the CMS world, and this is an article they wrote earlier this year called 24 Headless CMS That Should Be on Your Radar in 2019. And I've highlighted, I think, 6 of the ones that I've become most familiar with. But does anyone notice anything missing from that list? Drupal, right? It's not even on the radar in this world. There's another website called headlesscms.org that tracks all these CMSs. It's just people are so far beyond this idea of a monolithic CMS, and I'll show you later why that is maybe a bad idea, that it's just really not on the radar. But that said, this is all from the past 3 months, and I could have, if I had more slide space, I could have added 6 more of these. These are all commercial, and actually they're not all commercial. Strappy is actually an open source company who are raising giant amounts of money to build a CMS to handle all of the stuff I just talked about, in a way to bring your data into these systems. They can be very expensive, right? $879 a month, and it's often based on things like, hey, how many content types do you want, or how many records do you want in your system? And a record is everything from a taxonomy term to a user to a node to an image to a file. And very often these systems get very expensive very quickly. That said, almost all of them have free tiers to start to play with, and there are numerous open source options for these CMSs. But the fact is, I've now personally logged in and created accounts and or installed them on my computer to about 15 to 20 of those systems. And I can say with some confidence that every last one of them, including the ones that are $899 a month right now, are measurably behind Drupal in terms of what Drupal can do. And I have some more slides explaining exactly what those things are. But the reason I think, the reason I'm still at DrupalCorn and will continue going to Drupal camps, and why I still believe in Drupal so much, is some of the choices that Drupal has made over the past few years. This is a slide back from 2016. At each DrupalCon, Dries Boychart gives a state of the state about Drupal. And here he said, I shared my thoughts on where we should focus our efforts so that Drupal continue its path to becoming the leading platform for assembling the world's best digital experiences. And I think back then, maybe not a lot of people quite understood what that meant, but that has proved true with the release of, I think it was Drupal 8.7 about 6 months ago, or maybe a little bit longer, was this release of the JSON API. And this is a follow-up blog post that he wrote just a few months ago that says the JSON API module for Drupal is almost certainly the most feature-complete and easiest to use JSON API in existence. This one single fact, I believe, is why I'm still here and why you will still be here, and why 5 years from now or 10 years from now, Drupal will still be here and potentially a key player in this new world. I don't know how many of you are running Drupal 8 right now, either personally or for a project. So if you haven't already done so, even if you don't have any interest in what I'm talking about, just for the sake of doing it, go into your extend folder and enable the JSON API module. That's it, nothing else. There's no configuration, zero configuration. Then you go to this URL, and you're going to see all of the data from your Drupal site exposed. Everything from your entity references to your files to your taxonomies exposed in this very elegant and, as he pointed out, fully featured JSON API that now makes it possible to take your data from Drupal and put it somewhere else very easily. And so I believe that was a sort of absolutely key moment in Drupal's history. And that brings us to not only that, but some of the other important realizations, and that's that Drupal really solved most of these problems 10 years ago, right? Like, there's a reason we've all been working so hard to do all these things and to come up with this unified way of, like, how do we manage references and how do we manage taxonomies. Most of these other systems I've evaluated are absolutely primitive in terms of their ability to architect content. It usually comes down to pages, posts, and tags, and maybe some references. We have things like nodes and taxonomies, and very few of these have any concept of workflow, and if they do, you're going to pay a couple $100 extra a month to get access to that. Very few have content scheduling. A lot of them simply sort of punt on this idea of, well, how are we going to handle media or files? I don't know, right? So Drupal, on the other hand, for 10 years has solved all these things, and now, in addition to having solved them all, we have a way to just expose all that data and use it. And so it really is, I think, and I don't say, it would have been really hard for me to say this without having gone into those tools and used them, because their marketing is so good. And when you first log in, they're all built with these beautiful React-based interfaces that Drupal doesn't have, and it's suddenly like, wow, Drupal is horrible compared to this. But when you really start to dig under the covers and you see how much is missing, and again, we don't have things like record limitations or like, oh, well, you can have 2 roles, but if you want 3 roles, we're going to double your monthly cost, right? And so I would say that better than all 24 of those that were on that earlier list, that Drupal is arguably better at sort of the fundamentals of CMS and what we are trying to do with our websites. And so, it probably is the right tool for this one component of what the modern web looks like, which is content management, right? We're here to manage content. Drupal is a great way to do that. So the next few slides, what am I running out of time here? Well, do I have till 1:30?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're good. So this next slide is sort of going to just walk you through my personal journey and some of the things that I have learned over the past year and the approach that I've taken to like sort of moving myself and our company into this world. It's highly opinionated. You can disagree as you must. So if I wanted to torture you, I would start right here, because this is 3 years ago, this is what you would have to have had explained to people about, this is what you're going to have to do. You're going to have a node server. You're probably going to have to figure out Express and Redux and Babel and Webpack. And you're going to need to start to write a bunch of JavaScript or TypeScript, and then you'll pull all this stuff in, and learning about SSR and CSR, and then at the very end, you'll have to learn React, Vue, or Angular, right? I could have given 3 years ago a whole session on how horrible this was, but the truth is, just in the past probably year or two, things have become dramatically easier, and I'm going to go through a few tools that I've personally chosen to help on that path. The first one, I've talked to so many people who are absolutely paralyzed about React versus Vue versus Angular versus Svelte, and all other things being equal, I'm just going to tell you, use React, right? It's been adopted by Drupal. It's in, there's this JavaScript API to solve this problem of our currently clunky admin interface. WordPress has adopted it. I don't have a graph for it, but compared to the other languages, they have a similar hockey stick right now. And so I'm not saying Vue or Angular or Svelte that there's anything wrong with them, but if you're starting out right now today, especially if you're a Drupal developer, React is where you want to start, I believe. And the other, I put this up because if you read that, a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. Unlike Angular or some of the other ones, it's I think people are afraid of React because it seems like this big complex thing, and it is, in fairness, it is complex, but when it gets down to it, it's for taking this data from somewhere else and building this elegant user interface for it. That's all it is. There's nothing magic about it. It's like, how do we build a better user interface? And I think it tends to do a great job at that. Then the next big one is Gatsby, and this is my answer to that first slide I showed with the 30,000 things you're going to have to learn, and you're probably going to mess up 90 of them. Gatsby, how many people have heard of Gatsby, first of all? Okay, how many people have actually played with it or had experience with it? Okay, just a couple. So I want to say before I forget, Shane, who was in the back here, right after this session is giving a session on Gatsby and Drupal, and if you've never used it or experienced it, I would highly recommend going to it, because it's kind of changed my life in some ways in that it really is the epitome of that slide I showed earlier about how the modern web works and bringing data in from all these other places. And so at the top of Gatsby, you have the content layer or the data sources layer, where you can pull in data from anywhere. I don't care where it is. If you can access it on the web and it's in a machine-readable format, you can grab that data. And the way you grab it is this great sort of universal query language called GraphQL. So I can use the same query language to say, okay, go grab me all my recipe nodes from Drupal, go grab me these products from my Shopify store, go get me this data that I have in an Airtable, all using a single query language. That all gets built into what is called a fully hydrated React application that gets deployed to a static web host or a CDN statically after build time. And I won't go into too much about some of the potential drawbacks. The main one, and actually the next slide, I'll talk about that a little bit. But I highly recommend looking at this. And the main reason is that it, out of the box, solves 90% of the problems I put up on that previous slide, in that it's highly opinionated, and it is trying to teach you the right way to build very fast, very effective websites without having to learn 20,000 technologies. Whether or not Gatsby is a lot of people argue that Gatsby is the new WordPress. Right now WordPress powers, 45% of the web, and a lot of people think that Gatsby might be the answer to that. I don't know. But I do know that if you want to get into this world, it's a great place to start, because it just sort of, out of the box, sort of helps you along and solves a lot of these very complicated things. So I mentioned the potential drawbacks. One of the drawbacks is because of that build step. The one place where Gatsby and these sort of statically generated sites fall down a little bit is if you, let's say you're a sports website and you need constantly streaming in sports scores, or you're an active community and you have comment. Well, that you can't go through a build process every time you want to do that, right? And by build process, I mean you're grabbing all that data, assembling your React app, and then pushing it out to your static CDN. That's a step that you have to take. And once that step is over, you're sort of done dynamically assembling things. I mean, there are ways to do it because it ends up being a React app, but Next.js is sort of the, people compare Gatsby and Next a lot for the reason being that Next also solves a lot of these really hard configuration problems for you and just sort of how you're going to put all this together. It sort of does it for you and says, hey, this is a great way to build a modern day web app. And unlike Gatsby, they do have a static option, but their sort of focus is on what's called a server rendered application where you can do all of these sort of much more real-time dynamic things. So that's, I'd start with Gatsby, and as your needs get more complex, like let's say it's a membership site where you're taking payment and you want to expose certain areas of the site, Next.js might be the better place to look. I listen to a podcast called Syntex FM. I recommend it for any web developer. It's just kind of a fun podcast talking about some of the things that I've been talking about, and one of the hosts is Wes Boss. They did a great big episode on Gatsby and Next, and his quote was, I would never build anything in React without choosing Next or Gatsby. And I, right now today, could not agree with that more, mainly because it does sort of out of the box solve all of these very traditionally hard problems for us. I think I'm going to move along a little quicker here. The JAMstack, have people heard of this? We had a BOF on it yesterday. Very few people. I believe you're going to start hearing about it a lot more. I'll just read what it says. It's a modern web development architecture based on client-side JavaScript, reusable APIs, and pre-built markup. All hosted on a CDN, which means very fast. And Gatsby is sort of the poster child for what a good JAMstack framework can look like. And this is another sort of important thing about this world that I have found very, very different from the Drupal world in terms of a learning curve and how you even get started. In this world, I truly believe that it's kind of your playground. All of these services, every single one of them has free tiers, and in many cases, like if you start going to the Gatsby.js website or any of these websites, you can often do a one-click install and have a full, let's say a Gatsby site and a CMS called sanity.io, which is actually one of the great options out there, a GitHub repository, all hosted on Netlify for free, and you can be done in about 10 minutes just with the basics to have that up and running. In this world, we have all these things like Codebox, Sandbox, and Glitch, which are quite literally fully functional runtime environments where, again, you can go to CodePen and click, hey, create Gatsby app, and behind the scenes, suddenly you have a Gatsby platform that you can then interact with for no cost, just to start to learn with and play around. And often, a lot of these services and technologies have fairly incredible documentation. I don't know why that is. Maybe because Drupal has historically been, growing for so long, and everyone knows our documentation isn't the greatest. For some reason, I have found, just in general, the documentation in this world is far superior and useful in a way that sometimes, Drupal. Part of the problem with Drupal is like, oh, you want to do this? Okay, well, here's 30 different ways to do it, and maybe this one documentation page is right, but then here's these 20 that aren't. This seems much more sort of focused and results driven in terms of how they document things. So that sort of all leads to this second to last important realization, and that's that things that were super hard 5 years ago are now suddenly really easy and getting easier. 5 years ago when I was going to the Drupal camps and cons and seeing all these headless sessions and got really excited about it, but then realized like, well, how we have trouble convincing clients to pay, $50,000 for a website. How are we going to get them to pay $100? And it really was this sort of conundrum for us. But that's really rapidly changing. And so, I don't know how many of you are Redditors or used Reddit, but this is a long time Reddit meme. Would you rather fight 100 duck-sized horses or one horse-sized duck? Now think about that for a minute. Because that's really what we're talking about here, right? The big duck is Drupal, and you've sort of learned how to command and control that world, and these 100 duck-sized horses might be all these modern microservices and platforms that I've been talking about. And that's just a way of saying that as great as this is, and as fast as it is, and as great of a user experience as you can build, and as great as these tools are, it's not a panacea. You're not going to suddenly, you'll have new problems. You're going to still have problems building a website. So, I think some people get seduced and think like, oh yes, finally all these hard problems about building a website are going to be solved by this. That's not necessarily true, but that also doesn't mean it's not potentially a better way to do this. So I have a couple minutes left. I'm going to leave you with this tweet from Kyle Matthews, and then we have a few minutes for questions, but Kyle Matthews is the founder of Gatsby, and this was a tweet from earlier this year. Websites are just derived data, y'all. And that really resonated with me, especially in this world, because when you think about it, even in Drupal, right, our job is to take some data from somewhere. It might be an article or a recipe or a product, to bring that into somewhere else and then show it to the user. That's kind of what we do, right? And as we learned today, there are many ways to do that, and I am now in that sort of camp that believes that I think there's a better way than the way we've been doing so successfully for that past decade up until 2014. And so that concludes my session. I hope it was useful, and thank you for being here. Any questions or comments, or you want to yell at me? Yeah.
Not going to yell at you.
All right.
So the question about, or the comment that you received about we would steer clear of Drupal
Yeah.
Ruby or JavaScript. I mean, the obvious thing there is that Drupal's not a language. So, I mean, can you share a little bit more insight into that?
Yeah, so that particular project was a big data project. I think it was historical election data. And so in our heads, we were like, oh, that's perfect for Drupal. We can put millions of records, millions of these historical election data into Drupal, and it'll be perfect. But in their mind, they were like, no. What are you talking about? This needs to go in MongoDB, and we need to pull it up with a React-based interface. Like they just didn't want to hear about Drupal because, I can't tell you how, I now follow dozens of people on Twitter in this world, and I listen to dozens of podcasts, and, Drupal is just not a thing in that world. Like, they don't even know what it is, right? And so, and the people that do know what it is are sort of, Drupal has some baggage, right? Like, a lot of bad Drupal sites have been built, and a lot of bad UIs have been built for content editors, and people log into these new headless CMSs and see these flowing interfaces and drag and drop and like magically creating fields, and it's like, why would we ever choose Drupal? And they haven't looked behind that curtain to see like, oh, here's why we would choose Drupal. It's open source. We can do whatever we want with it with no limits. We're not going to pay for extra users or an extra record in our database, right? And so my hope is that over time, I think, obviously I had the slide about the JSON API, which I do think was sort of one of the more significant moments in Drupal's history, and perhaps the second most significant will be if and when we get this JavaScript API to just rip out all of our admin tools and rewrite it in React, which is what they're planning to do. It's going slowly from what I've been able to tell in the issue queues, but I think once Drupal has that, then suddenly we have it all, right? We've solved the fundamentals of CMS, and we have this great user interface to do it, and maybe that will be sort of hopefully a tipping point. Because I hope to still be working in Drupal 5 years from now and 10 years from now, and I don't believe that our company or any other company is going to be a growing successful company if that's all we do, whether it's WordPress or Drupal, because as you saw from all those numbers, the world is kind of leaving us behind right now, I think, and I guess that's sort of my perspective on the whole thing. Anybody else? Yep.
I have a lot of fun building Django websites.
Yep.
I really like that.
Yep.
But I don't do it for the person that I support because I'm the only guy that really kind of understands Django.
Right.
So isn't there a problem with all these different
Yeah, there is.
coming together of maintenance?
Absolutely. Maybe not maintenance, but more like, so we just actually, we pitched and sold a client on a giant Gatsby site, pulling in data from about 13 different places. And we internally realized, like, whoa, like, these are really non-technical people. It was a small volunteer-run group, and it's like, I don't think at that point in time we would have done them justice by just handing them all those tools, and so that's a problem we're still struggling with. But a lot of these things don't, that goes back to this idea of cost, right? Like, a lot of these things, I've been doing a lot of work in Airtable, right? Just to keep lists of things. That doesn't need maintenance or support, and someone's already minding that shop, right? All I need to worry about is is my data still getting pulled in successfully to Drupal? But that said, it is a real problem, right? Both for us as developers and for clients to get this mindset like, oh, when I want to go update this, I'm going to go over here. And so the way I've been starting to work through this is by building sort of dashboards, right, that point people to the right places. And actually, it all comes down, one of the other big powers of this, I think, is this idea of it being role-based. Like, let's say you're an organization and you have people whose job is to like blog once a week, right? Drupal is horrible for that because you get exposed to this giant interface that they're not going to ever touch 99% of it, but yet they still have to look at it and figure out that big content list. And so what if you could just have this one tool for your blogging team? They never have to log into Drupal. Maybe their Ghost is a great platform. That's what I've been using for some blogging, and it's just this really beautiful interface. I don't know if you've ever written for Medium, but very similar. It's a little bit like WordPress, WordPress Gutenberg. But what if you could just tell those people, like, hey, all you're doing here is blogging, so go use this gorgeous interface for writing. And then maybe you have a product team who needs to get into Drupal and tag things and do a lot more complicated things. And so that's where I think you start to maybe see the answer to that is like, you don't need to worry about all this complicated stuff. Just go do your writing, or go update the spreadsheet, or go update the store. But it's a conundrum for sure. All right, well, thank you all.